This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. What's in a name? That's an increasingly complex question for communities with public schools named after segregationist politicians. Two Education Week reporters are tracking both the campuses and the controversy, and they join us today. Corey Mitchell, welcome back.
Thank you.
And Andrew Ujifusa, great to have you here too.
Thank you, Emily.
Andrew, let's start with a little understanding of why Education Week wanted to build this database and tackle this topic.
Sure. So I think that in many ways, the project that we just did is a natural extension of the work that Corey and others at Education Week did last year, cataloging schools named after Confederates. But I think discussions about Confederates and things named after them are a conversation. It's a conversation we're used to having more and more. But when I was speaking to the Washington chief of the NAACP for this story, he said, look, discussions about things named for people like Strom Thurmond, who we highlight in this story, that's a conversation we're not really used to having so much. You know, to us, I think it was appealing when you can write about something that might spur that type of new conversation. Now, I used to be a reporter in Mississippi, so maybe that motivated me to a certain extent. And one night over drinks, which is where many great stories start, I think, I was talking with a friend about Corey's project, and she said, well, don't forget about those schools that are named after politicians from the Jim Crow era that had reprehensible views on race. And she mentioned a school down in Virginia that used to be named for Harry Byrd, for example. So I think there were different motivations for us to engage in the project.
You set up a database of schools named after prominent segregationists. Explain to us what the Southern Manifesto was and how that informed your criteria.
The Southern Manifesto was a document published in 1956. And the most basic way to put it is that it was a statement against Brown v. Board of Education decision from the Supreme Court in 1954. The manifesto basically said that the Brown v. Board ruling was illegitimate and that it would disrupt the system of public schooling that had emerged in the South over many decades. The manifesto also supported Southern leaders who the lawmakers said were resisting Brown v. Board by any, quote, lawful means. So, as I mentioned, about 100 lawmakers in Congress signed this manifesto. A couple who did not, I think it's worth noting, are Lyndon B. Johnson, the future president, of course, and Al Gore Sr. So we thought that that was a good place to start with our search because it was relatively recent in time compared to, say, the Confederacy. It was a document that specifically dealt with education, and these are some of the most powerful people in America at the time. That was our philosophy behind the database.
So what did you find out? How many schools are you talking about that are named after these segregationist politicians, and where are they located?
We found 22 such schools. They're all in the South. I think compared to the number of schools named for Confederates, it's about 1/9 that number. I think so far, if I'm remembering correctly, Corey, there are about 180 schools named for Confederates that Education Week is located in the U.S. So not a huge number of schools, I think, in the context of American public education. But, some might say that the more important statistic is that there are about 5,000 Black students, give or take, who attend these schools. That's not an insignificant number, I think, to many. So, it depends on what kind of number you want to focus on that might inform people as to whether this is a large number or not.
Corey, I do want to build off of your reporting because, as Andrew said, that was the impetus for looking at another level of these school names, specifically the segregationists. What's been the response of people when you tell them you're reporting on this? Are there people who say, look, it's just a name?
We heard that a lot. I think Andrew heard that in his reporting. I heard that when I went down to Edgefield County, South Carolina, to visit Strom Thurmond High School. But even though some folks say that it's just a name, there are people very passionate about the names of these institutions, these schools, these public spaces. And I saw that. And when I went down to South Carolina to report, there was a big fight in the early 70s over the name of Strom Thurmond High School. And people still harbor very strong feelings about that.
Well, it was interesting because in your reporting, you referenced that there was this 1970 legal challenge to changing the name of the school. It was closed by a judge without a ruling 3 years later, in part because you quote, Black students no longer object to the name of the school. What about right now? How do Black students who make up the majority of the school enrollment feel about their school's name?
I mean, the students know who Strom Thurmond was, but they still have a tremendous amount of pride in their school. When I went down to visit the school, I talked to a group of about 10 students, the majority of whom were Black. And in a very candid moment, they all began to sing the school alma mater in unison. Everybody at the school knows it. And there was a fight over the rebel mascot in the early 2000s, and a lot of Black students came out and said, hey, we want to keep that. That's who we are. For years and years and years, I think close to almost 40 years, this was the only high school in this rural community. So people have very strong ties to the school and to the name. The adults, there's a different story there, but for the children, they don't think much about it. They just think, hey, this is our high school. This is where we're from. And to some degree, this is who we are.
I was surprised when you reported that the school still had a segregated prom as early as the early 2000s. What surprised you about this school?
I mean, that was surprising. I mean, even though that this is a small rural community, that you would have a segregated prom is not even 2 decades ago. I think that that's a big deal. But I mean, there was a segregation academy that opened at the same time that this school was integrated, and it's just down the road. And it was named for this pro-Confederacy Civil War era secessionist. I mean, that lets you know that people took this very seriously. And race in this community, like many of the other places where these schools are named for segregationists, people with Confederate ties, I mean, race is still very complex and touchy subject for these people.
Andrew, I want to turn back to you for a moment. You talked with some experts about this idea of pushing for change for these names. Is that push really coming from the outside versus school communities confronting it themselves? Is it outside pressure?
I don't know to what extent there's any kind of movement that's comparable even to the push in different communities to rename things that memorialize Robert E. Lee. I don't think that there's that kind of pressure. Strom Thurmond, for example, is a relatively famous American politician, but he's not as famous as Robert E. Lee. And one superintendent I talked to in Mississippi about this issue, she said, look, I don't want anybody in my community to be offended. She has 2 schools named for a Jim Crow politician who was dead before the Southern Manifesto was written. But she said, look, I don't want anybody to be offended, but no one's brought it up to me, and I have a lot of fish to fry. I have a lot of things I have to deal with. So, I think that it would be a stretch to say that there is a push, but I think that when experts talk to me, they said it does make a big difference if people make the push from within the community, because this is not a federal government issue. Even though we're dealing with very difficult questions about history and race in this country, local school board members and superintendents talk about and vote on these issues. So if you want to make a change, those are the people, like with so many things, you have to develop relationships with and ultimately convince.
We're talking with Andrew Ujifusa and Corey Mitchell of Education Week about their reporting on schools named after segregationist politicians. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Corey, let's say a school wanted to change its name. How difficult would that be? What's standing in the way?
Well, in the case of Strom Thurmond High School, there's actually a lot. I mean, while some of the Confederate-themed schools have changed names in recent years, it's highly unlikely that it would happen at Strom Thurmond High School. That's because in the mid-1980s, the state legislature passed a law that the school shall, quote, hereafter so named as tribute to one of South Carolina's most distinguished sons. And I mean, this is a guy who was the school superintendent in the district. I mean, he was a presidential candidate. He was one of the longest serving senators in U.S. history. And he's still, to this day, beloved in that community. And the Democratic governor who signed that bill into law, basically saying this high school would be Strom Thurmond High School forever, went on to serve as education secretary during the Clinton administration. That's Richard Riley. When I talked to him, he said, hey, back then, there would have not been a reason for me not to support this legislation. It was a different time, a different era. As far as some of the other communities, it's hard to say, but these folks meant a lot to the communities that they served. And they're not only schools named after them, there's bridges and dams and buildings and colleges and institutions of higher education. So, I mean, their reach and their influence in their communities is strong and deep.
And Andrew, your reporting has actually been able to put something of a dollar figure, at least for some schools, on a name change. What is that figure?
Yeah, so this is actually from Corey's work on schools named for Confederates. But last year, there was one school that said it would cost more than $360,000 to change the name of the school. Now, to some districts, that might not be a ton of money, but if you're a small district in rural parts of the country, as I think a fair number of these schools are, that's a pretty significant dollar figure. And whether or not you agree with the idea of changing the name, that is a factor that school board members have to consider.
Corey, what do you know about how much the students are being taught about their own history here?
Well, in the state of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond's role in helping establish the Republican Party as the conservative party of the South and his sort of abandonment of the Dixiecrats is part of the state's curriculum. When I talk to students, I mean, they know about his history. They know about his biracial daughter. They know about his filibuster. I mean, so they're taught about Strom Thurmond, but I mean, they also think that, hey, this was a guy who was superintendent. This was a guy who put our county on the map. This was a guy that many people are proud of. But in turn, when they go outside their community, many of the students told me that other teenagers sort of jeer at them and say, hey, you go to Strom Thurmond High School. So I think when they're sort of in their own space, they embrace it because it's what they know. But when they step outside of their community, they're forced to really question what this person stood for and what he represented to folks who were around when he was still a sitting senator.
A lot of these guys are well known, or in some cases best known for things that many would consider positive contributions to society. When you think of Robert E. Lee, you think, well, he was a Civil War general who led a bloody slaughter in defense of chattel slavery. But Richard Russell, who signed the Manifesto and has a school named after him in Georgia, as well as a Senate building in Washington, I might add, he helped get the National School Meals Program off the ground. Another guy, Senator J. William Fulbright, many might know him as the guy who has an international scholarship named after him. So this is part of what makes this project in some ways complex and delve into issues that, might make people uncomfortable and talk about things they're not used to talking about when they're dealing with the historical legacies of people I voted for today. So it's complex in that way.
And that's a timely comparison, Andrew, because people in D.C. know, and probably some folks outside of D.C. are aware, there was a brief campaign to strip the Russell name off that building and replace it with the late Senator John McCain.
Yes, there was. I don't know if that's gone anywhere or not. Maybe eventually it will. So this may seem like a bit of a tangent, and maybe Corey will indulge me, but I used to be a reporter in Mississippi, and in 2003, the university voted to officially, quote unquote, retire the Colonel Reb mascot. Basically because, as one of my friends put it, he looked too much like a white devil slave master. In 2007, I went to an Ole Miss football game, which is like a religious experience in the South. You go to an SEC football game, and I looked over at the student section, and there was Colonel Reb, not the official one, but quote unquote unofficial Colonel Reb dancing around in the stands. So I say that because I think there's sort of an analogy to be made here. I think these schools are an echo of something that to some people might highlight the tradition and legacy and history of the South, but to other people might be an echo, a legacy of racism and opposition to integration and things now many people take for granted.
Corey, let me ask you, what should reporters be keeping in mind if they're covering a namesake controversy, whether it's a Confederate figure or a segregationist politician?
I think that as Andrew mentioned earlier, I mean, these are complex issues because you have people looking at it through very different lenses. And I think that you have to capture all of that because I think that when most people hear the name Strom Thurmond, they think of segregation, but the people in his home county, his hometown, see him as something completely different. So, I mean, it isn't as simple as saying, hey, this person was racist or this person didn't believe in integration. For many people in these communities, like, you have to work several different elements into these stories as a reporter to be fair to everyone involved.
And Andrew, what's your advice?
These leaders, in many cases, are notorious for their views on race at the national level, but they mean something different to the communities that they served. Again, people alive today voted for them and knew them in many cases, who live in those communities where there are schools named for them, I think. So it's difficult, as I said, to come in, especially as an outsider, and say, this is an outrage. I demand you change the name of the school. You may be right, but I think as a reporter, it's important to think about how long has the name been on that school, and what do people from different backgrounds say about it. I just think that's important, as Corey said, to get the different perspectives, even though the message from some sides, from some people, might be very stark. They might have very clear views on the issue.
If I can add something else, many of these schools named for Confederate leaders popped up in the 1950s as a clear backlash against the push for integration, the push for civil rights. And there was an intent to send a very clear message to people. With these schools named for segregationists, we see a generational difference. I mean, many of the students at Strom Thurmond High School and many of these other schools, the students weren't even alive when these people were serving in office, but they were not that long gone. So you have folks who are older in the community who remember Strom Thurmond, remember his votes on the Civil Rights Acts. If you weren't born yet when he died and he's just sort of a historical figure, you don't carry that same passion for the issue.
If I can just say one other thing. When I was doing reporting on this, people said, well, it's fair to ask, especially when students are told who this person was and their record and the things they said, how should we think about the fact that Black students are going to these schools named for men who, not just in the Southern Manifesto, but really said offensive things about race and integration? And then to add to that, I would say reporters can ask not just for Black students, but what does it say to white students who attend these schools that are named for these people? What message does it send to them? And, I think that this kind of idea of what it means to different students and how they should think about it can be applied to all of these situations, not just, schools named for Jim Crow politicians or Confederates, but anytime there's a controversy over a school name or a mascot.
I think that's terrific advice. And I would just add that I hope reporters take away this idea that it should be put into context of what students are being taught, what's expected in the standards, and what's actually being carried out in the classrooms. It seems like this is a great opportunity for some discussions and conversations, but obviously the students need to understand their own history.
Totally agree.
Andrew Ujifusa is an assistant editor and Corey Mitchell is a staff writer. They're both at Education Week and joined us from their offices in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, great to have you here.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you would like to know more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.